when Kathy does her intro and then stop it. Yeah, it's recording now. Can you pause it?
How do I pause it?
You click to where it says recording, the little thing at the top left.
Okay. Pause.
On. She is the outreach strategist and policy analyst for the Missouri Budget Project. She will present today the facts about and the costs of the Missouri Legislature's August 5th ballot proposed Amendment 5, which would repeal Missouri's state income tax. Jessica brings an extensive policy, outreach, and coalition building set of skills to her role at Missouri Budget Project. Prior to joining the Budget Project in early 2025, she served as a chief of staff in the Missouri Senate, managing a legislative portfolio that included the Appropriations Committee. Prior to her work in the Missouri Capitol, Jessica worked as senior account executive for Parson and Associates, working on public outreach and feedback from the public and other initiatives, as well as major city projects, and as a senior advisor for public affairs for Kansas City Mayor Sly James. Jessica earned her Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., majoring in international political economy. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. I will never get used to that. Thanks so much for having me join you guys. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. But yeah, as she mentioned, I'm with Missouri Budget Project. And we have been very focused on Amendment 5. Our organization really focuses on Missouri's budget, our fiscal policy, as well as our tax policy. And so Amendment 5 is definitely something that we have been watching and very concerned about. And so today I'm going to give you a little bit of information kind of about where we are fiscally in the state to kind of give you a deeper sense of what Amendment 5 would do. So Missouri right now, we have a revenue problem. In recent years, Missouri's revenue collections have fallen short of what we need to fund the general revenue parts of our budget. So essentially, we have developed about a $2 billion budget gap that has been growing. And the reason that this hasn't been a problem previously is because in the recent years, because of COVID, the state received a lot of federal stimulus dollars that basically allowed us to fill those gaps, enhance some of our investments, and also it allowed us to basically save general revenue for the future. However, that savings that we accrued has already basically been depleted and will be depleted by the next budget. So we are out of that extra funding. All of the COVID funds are expired or been used. So now we're back to having that budget gap very much visible. At the same time, general revenue collections have basically flatlined. In the last over a decade, we've seen relentless tax cuts over and over again, whether it be the corporate tax cut, capital gains tax cut, income tax cuts, that have depleted general revenue by about $3.8 billion a year. So our collections are declining. And so we are just simply not able to truly get to that funding level we need to just fund services as we have been. And so, like I mentioned, it's been reduced by $3.8 billion a year. Additionally, federal tax cuts like those that occurred in the One Big Beautiful Bill last summer have also affected Missouri's tax code. So our tax code is kind of coupled with the federal system, which means when they made those cuts, it also affected the amount of revenue that we were bringing in. Additionally, we have seen that Missouri has received huge federal cuts to really core programs like Medicaid and SNAP. SNAP, for example, it was estimated Missouri would have to come up with about $330 million just to fill in some of the gaps in SNAP. Additionally, Medicaid, we're also seeing that funding is also falling away as well, at a time that also increases people's healthcare costs. So right now, we're not only dealing that our revenues are down, but also that we're losing federal money as well. So we're getting hit on multiple levels. And a lot of people like to argue that Missouri, the governor and the state auditor have recognized that there is this huge funding gap. But the rationale of kind of the explanation that has been given is that Missouri has a spending problem, which when we look at other states, Missouri is pretty much behind every other state when it comes to investing in its people, investing in its services. We're about 49th in the state when it comes to revenue spent per K-12 student. And in fact, we are spending less now than we were on individual students in 2007. So we're not only underspending compared to other states, but even our historical investments. And so another example is our national health or our health spending compared to other states, $7 when the average is $63 per person. And that can result in things like us being ranking 40th when it comes to life expectancy. So underspending has severe consequences for the people of Missouri. And so to argue that this is a spending problem is not telling the full picture. And so this last session, the legislature passed a $50.7 billion budget. Of that, $15.9 billion is funded by general revenue. In this budget, we used up the remainder of our COVID savings. And then when it came to funding the foundation formula, they had to do some creative sourcing of funds, using money from the Blind Pension Fund and the Capital Commission to fill gaps in education funding. So taking away from the Blind Pension Fund, which supports visually impaired folks, to fund education. And one aspect of that is also the state auditor recognized that lottery revenue collections are down. That is one of the biggest ways that we fund education in our state. But those revenues have started to decrease and are not able to cover what we need for education anymore. So that is why we are dipping into those other sources. When it comes to why the lottery funding is down, there aren't really a ton of official explanations, but there is a trend in many states that when they legalize sports wagering, then you kind of see a reduction in lottery spending. Correlation, not necessarily causation, but that's kind of the trend. Okay, so again, when we're talking about where Missouri is, we're already dealing with shortfall in revenue, and we're also dealing with major cuts to our federal funding that we typically use, right? And so how does this kind of affect us overall? This is just a picture of kind of how our state funding is sourced throughout the budget, right? So that huge red portion, that's federal funds. And this is FY26. So this is before all the One Big Beautiful Bill cuts have also taken place. And so we would likely expect to see that the federal funding part is likely going to get smaller because of those changes. Other state funds include earmarked funds like the Missouri fuel tax or other taxes that are earmarked for very specific purposes that never touch general revenue. And then state general revenue, as you see, is that $15.4 billion. Sorry. And I think you can probably see the largest portion of that is the individual income tax. That makes about 65% of our collections. Our sales taxes only are a much smaller portion, as you can see. And I also want to draw your attention to the second to last one, the corporate income and franchise tax. That is one of the smallest portions. And we're actually seeing that collections are down for corporate income, which may also be tied to the One Big Beautiful Bill changes. And so this is how we fund our budget. And we're seeing that these different wedges are getting smaller and that we're needing to kind of fill those gaps. And again, it's 65% of state funding, about $8.7 billion in 2026's budget. That's a huge amount of money. And Missouri just doesn't have many other sources to collect from either. And so as we get into the tax system, I just want to show you, this is the, in 2023, this is how income is distributed in the state. So over 50% of all earnings made that year were made by the top 20% of people. So 20% of people made half of that. So about $200 billion. And so when we're talking about who can pay taxes, who can afford taxes, who should or should not, the folks in the top 20% have, have earned most of the money in our state. And at the same time, we have a very upside down tax system. So when we combine our local and state sales taxes and income taxes, we have a very upside down system. So the people who are making the least are paying the largest portion of their income towards taxes. Whereas the highest percent, the 1%, are paying a much smaller portion of their income in taxes. And why is this, right? Well, in Missouri, most people are paying most of their taxes through sales and property taxes. If you look at the lowest and the middle 20%, the largest portions of that are mostly sales and property taxes. Additionally, you see that kind of the people who are likely going to make the most out of this is going to be the top 1%, where most of their tax liability is income tax. And it does, it makes sense because income tax is based on your ability to pay. That is that is a tax that considers that ability, versus property and sales taxes just simply don't. And so it's a much more equitable form of taxation. But yeah, so we're talking about that people are already spending a lot of their tax dollars through sales taxes. So this year, as you guys know, Amendment 5, it's all about eliminating the income tax. And that at the very beginning of session at the State of the State, the governor made that his priority. And so in understanding that eliminating the income tax would eliminate the majority of state revenue, they recognized that they would have to find some kind of replacement. And so in the State of the State, the governor announced that they would replace revenue by expanding the sales tax to services. And in that State of the State, he also mentioned that he would like to see exclusions for healthcare, agriculture, and real estate. Well, in the final amendment, it does some of those things. It places a constitutional amendment on the ballot, right? And it puts in our Constitution to eliminate the income tax, that the legislature has to eliminate the income tax. And at the same time, it also gives the legislature 5 years where they can expand or raise the sales tax and expand the sales tax to services over those 5 years without going to the voters for approval. So basically, they're trying to get, it's basically like a pause in the Hancock Amendment, which requires the state, whenever they want to raise taxes, to go to the people. The legislature can cut taxes at any time. They've been doing that. And so they could theoretically just pass a piece of legislation to eliminate the income tax, but they're choosing not to. They're choosing instead to put this in the Constitution, to expand their powers, and then also to leave many questions unanswered. So essentially, they talk about services. They don't define them. They don't mention any. They also do not exempt any services, as Kehoe had mentioned. In previous versions of this, they had exempted agriculture, real estate, and healthcare. But in this version, nothing is exempted. And so essentially, lawmakers for those 5 years would have free reign to pass whatever sales tax increase on whatever services without voter oversight. So basically giving them a blank check and they're not expecting voters to just trust them. And so this is just kind of to emphasize, like, what if they, so this amendment gives them the ability to raise sales taxes and expand them. So theoretically, if they wanted to replace all the income tax revenue with sales taxes just by raising the sales tax, they'd have to raise the state sales tax to about 11.5%. And so when you combine all that that means like the average sales tax in Missouri would be about 17%, just for, just for purchasing, the basics, groceries, all those kinds of things. And so this would make things even more affordable for people who are already struggling right now when it comes to, we have high gas prices, housing's expensive, groceries are getting more expensive. And it doesn't seem like there's a clear end to all of that. And so this would make things much more affordable for, the folks who are already paying the most in sales and property taxes. And so they say services. Well, when they talk about services, they don't define them. That's still to be left to be decided. But certain, like the Tax Foundation, for example, has put out information kind of guiding what kind of services would be taxed. So usually it starts with consumer-based services. And so meaning that everyday people will have to pay more when it comes to the services they need every day. So be that car repair. We're all used to, paying maybe sales tax on the services, but not the labor. But now that could be in play. When it comes to home repairs, landscaping, lawn mowing, pest control, all these things that homeowners have to deal with, making it more expensive for people who are trying to stay in their house. And also, other kinds of services. And technically, because we don't have any exemptions, this could also apply to healthcare services. It could apply to dental services, things like that. Nothing is protected in this amendment. And the thing is, when it comes to other states that have done this, that have expanded a sales tax to services, they have not done it with the intent of replacing the income tax, right? They've done it in smaller applications. So consumer-based services is typically what happens. But here, they're using this to replace the income tax revenue. That's a much larger amount of money. And so, replacing $8 billion with a sales tax on services would require them to really expand it much more broadly than consumer-based services. And so, typically, I do think most of the time they recommend not doing business-to-business services, but it simply wouldn't be enough. So it could even apply to professional services like accounting or outsourcing HR or things like that. There's a lot of types of businesses, whether you're construction, engineering, architecture firm, those are all considered services. So, businesses like that could be even less competitive when they're bidding against other businesses across the state. It could make our companies even less competitive when that's kind of, one of the arguments on the other side. So again, this doesn't exclude any exemptions, and it leaves the next General Assembly, many of whom have not even been elected yet, to figure this out. And similar to those, in engineering and construction firms who are placing these bids, they would never do half of a bid. You know what I mean? They wouldn't come to, do that. So they're really just asking for a blank check there. And so because of that shift in taxes to sales taxes on services, most Missourians would likely see an increase in their taxes if Amendment 5 were to eliminate the income tax. And so when we've done our, modeling and everything like that, so say we exclude healthcare, real estate, and agriculture. We apply this to consumer-based services. We still have a $5 billion hole. That $8 billion hole has just become a $5 billion hole. And that's still not, there's no way to avoid major cuts to our services with that huge of a cut. And so that means that, services would definitely see cuts. People would lose service. We would see even less quality services. And, going back to kind of where we rank, we're already below other states when it comes to those services. And a lot of proponents like to compare us to states like Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, who are no income tax states. However, those places, not only do they have higher sales and property taxes for most of their residents, except for the wealthiest, they also have other alternative sources of revenue. They have oil, gas, tourism, theme parks, national parks, where they get lots of visitors, and they can get they would generate sales taxes from that. Missouri doesn't have that. We simply are not typically compared to those states when we're competing, right? And also we don't have those kinds of resources that would generate that kind of additional revenue. And just another thing that would be at risk would be tax credits. So, in order to fill out your tax credit, you kind of have to fill out an income tax return. And so many of these many of these tax credits that are funded largely by income tax revenue would disappear. And so, when it comes to, the circuit breaker, which is supposed to help seniors be able to more easily afford to stay in their home, we would see the end of that program. We would see, and a lot of these nonprofit groups, for example, diaper banks, they heavily rely on tax credits to fund, their operations. So, at a time when the federal government has already started pulling out grants and money from the nonprofit sector, from the social assistance sector, when we then will have, less money for our own social assistance programs, all of these other supporting kind of nonprofits that also supply that assistance would also kind of lose that funding. Things that allow people to stay in their homes or improve neighborhoods, all of those would largely, either lose funding or, be completely eliminated. There's also the fact that not everyone is paying the income tax. There's a lot of folks who are on Social Security, there are veterans and people with disabilities who are not currently paying the income tax. And so they wouldn't receive any type of cut. But then a lot of the services, and especially, if we don't exempt healthcare, a lot of services that those folks are relying on will now suddenly be more expensive. They're on fixed incomes. There's not room for that. And so we'd really see that affect some of our most vulnerable citizens who need those services. And then the new Amendment 5 actually could create the possibility of applying another gas tax on top of the motor fuel tax if they wanted to. And as you may have heard, there have been calls to Kehoe to suspend the motor fuel gas tax right now because, gas prices are high. His response to that was, the motor fuel tax funds the jobs and the projects, the infrastructure projects that we need. And so, we can't simply suspend that. And so I don't know exactly, that logic makes sense to me, but I'm not sure why it doesn't apply to the income tax. And so just driving this even further home. So when we look at, we looked at that chart that showed the whole budget, and this is how you break it down when it comes to each department. So, you're looking at social services. That's going to be SNAP and Medicaid. That huge red portion is going to get smaller in the future. We're going to have to fill in either with more general revenue or just cut folks. We also use a lot of general revenue to fund elementary and secondary education. And so, kind of where this dark blue is, all of that would get substantially smaller, while some of this red, the red funding from federal funding is also getting smaller. So we will simply just have less to be able to fund. And so when we're talking about, services and what could get cut, if we were to see them, still have that $5 billion hole in the budget, and if we kind of took an even cut to all departments, education, for example, would probably lose about $1.4 billion. That's about 27,000 teachers, 46,000 support staff, or about a cut of an average cut of $1,800 per student. And this is really critical for rural areas who simply just don't have the same resources and whatnot, and really rely on the state for funding. And so, a lot of these school districts are struggling as it is. And this would certainly make things even worse and even harder, and truly limit folks' ability to access education. And one of the biggest points I'll go back to as well is that one of the proponents like to argue that this is to attract new businesses because people think about the income tax when they want to start a business. From the research that we have. And also from talking to people who work in economic development, who work on attracting these kinds of companies, that's simply not the case. they've cut taxes for years, and that hasn't necessarily, resulted in income of businesses, racing to come to Missouri. In fact, one of the key things that businesses are looking for is a skilled workforce that has supports. And so a skilled workforce depends on education. So in this effort to try to attract businesses, we're actually going to we could make us less attractive because we're really putting our workforce at stake and the Missourians and their abilities and their needs at stake. So, this could really hurt Missouri. Cutting the income tax is going to cost something, right? It's going to come from somewhere. And I think most people are really understanding that. And so, Amendment 5 would be very, very bad for the state. It would leave us in a position where we simply could not easily recover. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Kansas, with Governor Brownback, when he eliminated income taxes, I think around the 2010s. They passed a law, right, and eliminated it. They immediately saw huge impacts to services, education, some of their best high schools, like seeing impacts. And so, that was a failed experiment that the legislature then repealed. In this case, we can't simply do that, right? Not only are they putting this in a constitutional amendment to put it in the Constitution, so then we would have to pass another constitutional amendment to repeal it, we would also then have to go to the voters to ask them to reinstitute the income tax and have to tax themselves, which is a very heavy lift, right? In Kansas, they just repealed it. But here we'd have to go through all of those steps because while they wouldn't be subject to the Hancock Amendment, we would in trying to, reestablish our tax revenue and all of that. So this isn't something you can simply reverse or be done with. This would take a lot of effort. And on the other side, if this were to pass, we're expecting, applying sales taxes to services when we don't necessarily know what those services are. We haven't done that before. That is a lot of work for a Department of Revenue that requires a lot of nuance. And so, talking about having less funding, but then needing to kind of figure more of these things out just simply isn't making sense. But so this So on August 4th, you'll have the opportunity to vote on Amendment 5. And so that'll be our primary election. We know that they are kind of counting on the fact that primary elections have low turnouts. And so we need help getting people to the polls. We need help letting people know about this issue, but especially letting people know that it's time to vote. It's time to get out there. We need everybody at the polls by August 4th or before if they do early voting. And so this also has my contact info, but also there are folks working on Amendment 5, and this is kind of where you can find out more about that by scanning the QR code, or you can go to, if you would like, you can go to knoweverythingtax.com. And quickly before one other point I've added on. There's been some kind of new advertisements out there that are making some claims about taxing data centers. So I want to address that really quickly. And I haven't seen all of the ads about this, but this Amendment 5 could theoretically allow us to tax data centers. But what they're not saying is that this is because in 2015, the state passed legislation to exempt data centers from a sales tax. And so, for example, if they were to build a new facility, make a $25 million investment, make a promise to hire 10 full-time jobs over 2 years, they would receive a 100% state and local sales tax exemption. And what's kind of interesting about this is, like, sometimes you see this where they exempt the cost of constructing the data center, right? Or like they want to make the construction part easier to make it happen. And so, those are standard. But what's odd about this to me is that it's not just for construction. So they can, and I realize that the number's not on here, but this exemption lasts for new facilities for 15 years. 15 years, they get an exemption on electric energy, gas, water, telecommunications, internet services, just used in the data storage center. It's not about construction. It's just they're on for 15 years. They get a sales tax exemption on their utilities. Also on their machinery and equipment that they are using there. So their computers, their, all that kind of stuff. And then also the sale of tangible personal property materials for the construction of the data centers. So they basically got a sales tax exemption to purchase most of their equipment, a lot of this stuff, for 15 years already. And so if we were to pass Amendment 5, then theoretically we could reinstitute, take out that exemption and whatnot. But in my opinion, and kind of how I've heard this messaging, that's not the impression they're trying to give. They're trying to give this impression that it would allow us to start doing that, an amazing thing. But it's simply because they've already taken action, one of the earliest states to do it, to make sure that these companies didn't have to pay sales tax. And enabling and creating a much faster pathway for data centers to be built. And so that is, we also have a paper on this that I can share. But just to kind of let folks know that that's kind of some of what's behind that. At this point, I am open to questions if you have any, and I think there's some folks maybe in the chat. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Dave.
Yeah, if you could maybe clarify a bit more on what you were talking. So the existing facilities that are already under production, and already getting these exemptions, those will maintain or be sustained for the period already agreed to. In other words, passing Amendment 5 would apply to anything new that hasn't already been brought under this scheme, but anything which is already in the scheme is going to be grandfathered in, yes or no?
That is completely unclear.
Okay.
They haven't on the, when they've discussed Amendment 5 or like in the legislature or elsewhere, they never brought up data centers. They never brought any plan about that. This is simply something they've started mentioning in advertisements. And so I can't say with 100% certainty of that, but I would think it in other circumstances, it would seem like they would likely be grandfathered in, and based on how, they've been afforded a lot of these benefits, I think it would be very difficult to actually see that happen. And so likely, probably, if it, and that would require them though to pass legislation to do that. So they would actually have to do it. And they haven't necessarily mentioned this piece at all, just that about taxing data centers, very vague information. Does that answer as best, like, as much as?
No, it tells me that they don't know what they're doing either. That's
No.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
2026 data center is a very different animal than a 2015 data center was.
Right.
It's surprising that never even came up in the legislature. Herb, question? Comment?
Yes, by the way, you're still displaying your last screen rather than the group here. But I want to thank your organization and you personally for stating the obvious. And I'm fully supportive. There is a tradition in Missouri noted by David Thielen, the progressive historian who left Missouri in disgust many years ago to go to a more culturally advanced state. I think it was Indiana. And declared in an essay that he published in the newspaper many scathing things, including the memorable expression, Missourians believe that anything can be had cheap. You have made the point well, and it's been made many times without impact on our state society, that Missouri as a state is behind nearly every other state in funding and providing social services per capita. But you, with your background at Georgetown, with my friends and colleagues studying international political economy, can put us in a world context. Are we any better as a state in these regards than other states you would like to name? Oh, I don't know. How about the Central African Republic?
It's always very interesting, because I think there's a lot of folks who don't I think the biggest thing that we need to remind everyone is that we do not live in a vacuum. Amendment 5 is not in a vacuum. What we do, Missouri cannot operate in a vacuum and expect that, things will just be fine. And I think, you bring up a really good point, and I can't exactly speak to kind of how we compare or whatnot, but it is striking that folks, don't recognize that there are other countries who actually provide a lot of these services, or how interconnected we are. For example, we're talking about, groceries are expensive. It's not only gas, it's also fertilizer. We have farmers in the state who, our biggest exports are soybeans, right? Who do we think the biggest buyer of soybeans typically is? China, right? And with these, federal trade policies and whatnot, and even like the soybean associations and whatnot, supporting, politicians who are, who are putting forward these policies, especially these trade policies. And this is just me speaking from like a more, from my background, not necessarily Missouri Budget Project, but yeah, it's counterproductive, right? So with all this tariffs and everything, maybe those go away, but the relationships have been burnt. And so we know that we're used to having those buyers, but there are other countries who are growing soybeans now. There are other people that are competing with us. And so if we're not able to keep those relationships and maintain them, Missouri does suffer. Our farmers need to export their crops. A lot of our farmers are struggling because of other cuts to USAID, where they, were responsible for crops that were bought by those programs to feed people. And so they're sitting on food and whatnot. And so some of these farmers have been growing less because of the fertilizer issues. And so, and this is like way out of Missouri Budget Project, but we're talking about, what's going on internationally with fuel prices. We don't necessarily see a clear end to that, and that affects fertilizer. So that's causing pressures. Folks can afford things, but then also on the horizon, they're expecting one of the worst El Niños in a very long time. And El Niño is, has to affect the weather patterns and what have you, that basically creates the warming, all these different things. But here it might mean lots of rain, extreme weather, but the rest of the world are likely to experience severe drought, famine, and what have you. Those areas also grow food that we buy. And so, when things like that happen, when other places don't have enough food, aren't producing as much, that means the overall food supplies goes down, right? That means prices will get even more expensive for food. And so when it comes to kind of how, like, the policies we support in Missouri, and then also what Missouri supports at the federal level, it's incredibly important to understand those relationships. We are not just, operating on our own here. And so, folks, there's a lot of other more cultural sentiments that, people prioritize over these other, factors that really, impact our survival and how we're doing and our health and all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, like, there's other countries that provide, free healthcare that, we would never expect. And so, I will do a little bit more researching on that, kind of how we would compare to other, countries and across the world. But yeah, we're at least connected to them and we rely on them. And so that's a very huge factor. I'm not sure that I answered your question fully, but yeah, like, certainly we what's happening in the rest of the world will ultimately affect us.
Yeah. Thank you. Alice?
Okay, thank you. So this is kind of two questions. One, a county commissioner said to me, she's an attorney, if this passed, God forbid, and it failed, we could not easily cancel it because of the Hancock, which of course they're
Correct.
overriding to even have it. Second question is, this experiment has happened in a number of states around the country. I was just listening, Wyoming wants to cancel their property tax, but Florida doesn't have sales tax. Maybe Texas, I'm not sure. How can those states handle it with their large populations, like Florida, 25 million people? yet
Mm-hmm,
it's so devastating on our economy in Missouri.
So I wouldn't say that they're handling it. I would, like in those states, property taxes are incredibly high. And you see a lot of those, a lot of real estate being developed, a lot of housing issues. And I'll just share this again. So, maybe, additionally, those states that they're talking about that don't have an income tax, they have very high sales and property taxes. And then they also have these other sources of revenue that they can leverage and rely on. They're also experiencing, greater investments and whatnot. However, that doesn't mean they're out of the clear. They're not necessarily, it's not like they're not making cuts or they're not seeing impacts to their services and whatnot. So I don't know that it's necessarily that they're handling it. I think that there's just trade-offs in what they offer to the citizens of their states. I don't know. I was reading today that, and this is beyond state services, but for example, Florida right now, because of some of the immigration projects that occurred in Florida, I will leave that to you guys to, you probably know what I'm talking about. Because so much money, they used money from their disaster preparedness fund to construct a facility for the immigration issues, and basically almost exhausted that fund. So going into hurricane season, Florida has a very, very, very small amount in their emergency preparedness fund. And, we're expecting bad weather and whatnot. And so, in other ways, they've lost funding as well. So, it's not necessarily that they figured it out. It's just they've made trade-offs and prioritized, who gets what.
I will say, like Florida has a large tourism, and I missed this part of your discussion.
Okay.
But they also, like Georgia and maybe 15 other states, have something that if that's your primary residence, what is it called again? You get a cut on your property taxes. Oh, what is it called?
Mm.
Homesteaders, which Missouri does
Mhm.
not have.
Mhm.
But that's just another issue. Thank you. That answered it
Mhm.
well.
Yeah, well, and especially in Florida, where like so much of their population is just like seasonal. Um, I can see that. Anybody else have questions?
There are some
Oh,
typically conservative groups, anti-tax groups that are opposed to this amendment, including realtors. Any other opposition that you're aware of that might be unlikely allies for us?
well, yeah, this is really, really resonating with the Republicans because this is, I mean, and conservatives in that like Republicans are passing a constitutional amendment to make it easier for them to raise taxes. So a lot of those groups, we've been presenting to Republican groups that are very concerned about this. Probably the most activated group like across the state has been superintendents and school boards, especially public schools in rural areas that understand how much this will impact them. And so, yeah, we have the realtors. We recently were able to get the Missouri architects on board. I will say there is kind of, I think more and more people are getting more comfortable coming forward, but there is a bit of an intimidation factor as well. So, we've had, the fact that many chambers have not endorsed Amendment 5 is a very good thing. We wish they would publicly come against it. But we don't see a lot of enthusiasm from the business community. Even a lot of Republicans that had supported this in the legislature now are kind of backing off of it. So this is generally people. It's not the best plan, and so people are when they learn about it, they are very, very upset. So a lot of folks in rural areas and even conservative groups are organizing about this because it comes down to your checkbooks and just being able to make it through. And I also think in some of those rural areas they also can appreciate having in their own communities, like their mom and pop shops have been forced out by big corporations and things like that. And so I think that there is recognition that there is not only underinvestment in those areas, but that this is not going to help it at all. So yeah.
Question from the chat. It says several ads for Amendment 5 say property taxes will be cut. Is this true?
That is a technicality. They love technicalities. So this does not provide any kind of property tax relief. So what this does, so essentially what happens, so if the state were to expand the sales tax base, that automatically expands the sales tax base for local taxes. So basically, if they were to expand the sales tax to services, the local level, cities, counties, would see an increase in their revenues, which a lot of them need right now. However, they do not want that. The legislature wanted to make sure that this was revenue neutral as much as possible. So if the state is to do that, if the state ends up expanding the sales tax to services, whatever services have you, the localities are required to adjust. It could be their property, earnings, or sales taxes, so that it basically eliminates any windfall from that from those changes. So they just ensuring that they will not make any additional revenue from these changes. And so that means them having to adjust property, earnings, taxes, and everything, things that have been voted on and approved locally, which is a thing in itself. But so that in that way, there might be a small adjustment to the property tax, but at the same time, that's because you're going to be paying more in sales tax on services. So that is the only reason that they can even say anything about property taxes. But that is simply, they haven't provided any kind of form of property tax relief. And when this is in the Senate, 3 Republicans stood up against this. One of them being a Republican who had been really dedicated to working on property tax issues, which, from my perception, is kind of the issue that most Missourians were more upset about, is property tax reform. And, he was upset because this was not, meeting the needs of folks, and it wouldn't do anything for property tax relief. So, yeah.
Another question from the chat. Can you tell us what groups are supporting Amendment 5 and why?
Yeah. So the realtors are kind of running their campaign. The realtors in 2015 passed a constitutional amendment that prohibited sales taxes on services. So Amendment 5 would totally undo all of that. And so, they're working with folks in the business community. We are working with a coalition, our usual coalition of folks. So, organizations that work in healthcare, children's organizations, education organizations, senior groups and whatnot, disability groups, a lot of the folks who are going to be most impacted by these services. We also have.
The question is who supports it. The question was who supports Amendment.
Oh, supports it. I'm so sorry. That was backwards. Right. That's a good question. So most of the funding has been from an organization that was started in Delaware called, I think, Missouri Promise. So that's where a lot of their money has come from. Who's supporting it? So who carried it? So Kehoe supports it. Trent Watson, Senator Curtis Trent. Sorry, there's a lot of Trents. Senator Curtis Trent, and then Representative Bishop Davidson. Americans for Prosperity are one of the main groups that are going around the state talking about this. And there's other supporters. It's not aside from that, there's not necessarily a huge strong coalition. So yeah, and I think a lot of this legislation came out of the eliminating the income tax legislation. A lot of this has been pushed for a while in the legislature. And it's been pushed before. They've tried this before. But a lot of the stuff comes from ALEC. ALEC, who puts out that template legislation for conservative policies and whatnot. There are definitely certain interests that have been pushing income tax cuts in Missouri, at least for a while, that are part of this. But I can't totally speak to all of that. But yeah, Americans for prosperity. And those folks, yeah.
Rex Singfield, a big supporter of this. Isn't he funding some of this?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
I noticed in your graphic that while all school districts will be affected in Boone County, was Harrisburg, Sturgeon, and Southern Boone that would be most affected. And I hope the generally conservative voters from those districts are aware of that fact, and that the schools hopefully will make that point.
Yeah.
Well, for the record, when John Martin ran for his seat he now has, he was on record saying the schools could be run on sales taxes. He's been behind eliminating income taxes from day one. So that's where his head is. Just yeah, he owes a story to those school districts.
Another question, Herb?
Yes, thank you. I would hope you will talk a little bit directly about the importance of getting higher than normal turnout for this August election. If this proposal is to be deleted, historically, August primary elections draw only a small fraction of November. And so bills of this type, which are advocated by people with higher income and better off, are typically put, if they can do it, on the August ballot. And the biggest fall off always is among those who are less well-to-do and less educated. We must get those folks out if this is to be defeated. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. And so when, we've had a very short runway for this campaign. The governor took a very long time to decide which ballot it would be on. Maybe drawing out time. And so he put it on the August ballot, which was, barely enough time to get ballots printed. And so, as he mentioned, primaries, we are not expecting super high turnout most of the time. And a lot of the turnout is largely conservative Republican voters who typically might be supporting something like from that's been put out by these proponents. And so we definitely need higher turnout. And we are working on getting that information out to those communities and those folks. And we also I can send materials today also that organizations in your community, people in your community that making sure that they get they know about this is critically important. Making sure that your friends and family know about the August primary and go with you. That's incredibly important as well. But yeah, making sure that we are doing as much as we can to help people get to the polls, whether it's giving rides, making sure people are there, because they were putting on this ballot, counting on the fact that there would be low turnout. Some of the positives, the work is never done. I will we keep pushing and all of that. And so, our polling has been fairly positive in that it's showing that this is just getting less and less liked. It starts pretty low, especially with likely Republicans. That doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. We need to get everybody out there. And, I believe we can already start voting now. Early voting has, no, I'm sorry. I'm not sure. Should double check that. I should know that. Early voting is coming up pretty soon. And so folks can, go ahead and get their vote in early at their leisure, so they don't have to worry about making if they're in August, if they're busy and all that. So encouraging people as much as you can to vote early and to make sure they get to the primary. It's important.
Justice, question.
Yeah, so one of the things I saw with the taxes and the implementation of eliminating the income tax and then bringing in the sales tax and then possibly expanding service taxes was that there'd be revenue triggers. What I was wondering about is if there's deficits to the budget and they're not making revenue as is, especially after the code funds dry out, would it even be possible for them to hit those revenue triggers? Do you know what the revenue triggers are?
So they took the revenue triggers out. So there are no revenue triggers in Amendment 5. So, and we've had revenue triggers for the other tax cuts that they've done, and it hasn't mattered. So, those triggers really end up kind of being a little meaningless. And in this case, they don't even have them. So at a certain point, they did have triggers that they put in. They had even like a schedule or timeline of possibly eliminating the income tax, but all of that was removed in the final version. So, those we don't even have those to, possibly count on or, use, unfortunately.
So that means the tax cuts go into effect entirely after should it pass to be, whatever the legislative period is after it's passed? I mean, it's a full stop of everything.
So they still have to pass legislation to like enable the income tax cut. They still have to pass another piece of legislation to do that because they didn't put any details in this.
Okay, I got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I think there was another part of your question though. Yeah. So they would have to pass another piece of legislation. Theoretically, it's in the piece of legislation, it's supposed to be revenue neutral. So anything, they can only they have to, basically, if they have a finding that they think that this would lead towards replacing the income tax, that would be enough for them to pass a sales tax increase without knowing if that's really the case. And so that would also theoretically, and these details are not completely made, but then if that were to be the case, then theoretically they would then start cutting the income tax. But it's not based on whether it does end up replacing the income tax. It's more based on a finding from the legislature if they think it will do that. So it's not even exactly like a real check, right? Because you would maybe expand sales tax services for a year, see how much revenue that brings in, and then cut the income tax to that level. But it's not even that there's a lot of room for interpretation of what a finding is, what that means. And so there's a lot of flexibility that they've given themselves.
Any more questions? Then thank you, Jessica, for excellent presentation. I know a lot of us really like graphs too, so thanks for putting those in this group at least. But yeah. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Of course, thank you guys, and thanks for all the questions. And thanks for supporting us. So.
Thanks. Okay. Back to our regular meeting and
I know.